Behind me is the edge of the forest where Ada Sloan walked away in 1943 after lawmen locked her 8-year-old son in a cage for stealing a loaf of bread. She spent the next 50 years alone.
She survived 50 years in the wilderness after slaughtering 22 men who caged her son like animal. For 50 years, she was nothing but a whisper that lawmen spoke of in hushed tones, a legend that mothers told to explain the sounds that came from ridges where no human should have lived. They called her the Mother of Pine Mountain, a ghost who had killed 22 men and then vanished so completely that even the federal government abandoned the search. But the mother was not a ghost. She was a woman named Martha Fugate, and she had been watching from the wilderness the entire time, waiting for death to reunite her with a son whose suffering she had avenged with methods that the civilized world could not comprehend. This is the true story of the deadliest mother in Appalachian history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Letcher County, Kentucky, in the heart of the Eastern Highlands, during the brutal years of the early 1940s when the coal companies ruled with an authority that no government could challenge. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the Revolutionary War, who considered themselves citizens of the mountains before they were citizens of any nation that claimed dominion over them. You see, in Letcher County during the years of our story, the coal operators had created a system where company interests determined everything from who held office to who lived or died. The deputies who enforced company will wore badges purchased with company money, served warrants issued by company judges, protected company property with violence that the law called legitimate. A family that defied the operators could find itself destroyed without any recourse, could watch helplessly as children were taken and parents were killed, and everything they had built was scattered to winds that carried no justice. The woman at the center of our story was born Martha May Combs in 1902 in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where her family had lived since 1810. She had married Ezekiel Fugate when she was 18, had built a life with him that included a son whose arrival had transformed everything they understood about love and purpose. She was 39 years old in the autumn of 1941, a woman whose appearance concealed capabilities that the outside world could not have imagined. That's right. Martha Fugate was not the kind of woman that strangers underestimated twice. She stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, had dark hair that she wore pulled back in a practical braid, possessed eyes that were the gray of winter sky, and that seemed to see things that others missed. Her body was strong from decades of mountain labor, her hands were calloused from work that never ended. Her mind was sharp in ways that exceeded what her limited formal education might have suggested. She had learned to survive in the mountains from a father who had recognized something in her that he had not seen in his sons, a capability and determination that he had nurtured with teaching that was usually reserved for boys. She could track game through forest that others found impenetrable, could shoot with accuracy that exceeded most men, could survive in wilderness that would have defeated people with more resources but less knowledge. The skills lay dormant during the years of her marriage, but they remained available if circumstances demanded them. Her husband Ezekiel was a miner who had spent 20 years underground, whose lungs were beginning to show the damage that the coal dust inevitably caused, whose body was weakening from labor that the company extracted without concern for the human cost. He worked because the family needed income that the small farm could not provide, sacrificed his health for wages that barely sustained the household he had created. Their son was named Samuel, and he was 15 years old in the autumn of 1941, a boy whose gentleness seemed incongruous with the harsh world he had been born into. Samuel had his father's quiet nature and his mother's sharp mind, possessed a sensitivity that Martha both treasured and worried about. He was not suited for the mines, was not built for the brutal labor that the coal companies demanded, was a dreamer whose imagination ranged far beyond the hollows where he had spent his entire life. Samuel loved animals with a tenderness that made Martha proud and concerned in equal measure. He would spend hours nursing injured creatures back to health, would weep when death came despite his efforts, would form connections with animals that he struggled to form with people. The boy had a gift for understanding creatures that could not speak, for communicating with them in ways that seemed almost magical to those who observed. The trouble that would destroy the Fugate family began with events that had nothing to do with Samuel's nature, or with any offense the family had committed. The coal operators were engaged in a labor dispute that had turned violent, and they had responded by unleashing their deputies on anyone suspected of union sympathies. The violence was indiscriminate, targeted families based on rumors and grudges rather than evidence of actual organizing. A deputy named Vernon Crawford had developed a particular hatred for the Fugate family, a hatred that had roots in events that predated Samuel's birth. Years before, Ezekiel had testified against Crawford's brother in a matter involving stolen equipment from the mine, testimony that had resulted in the brother's imprisonment and the permanent stain on the Crawford family name. Vernon had never forgotten, had waited for an opportunity to repay what he considered a debt, had found in his badge the authority to pursue vengeance that would have been impossible otherwise. Crawford convinced his superiors that the Fugate property was being used for union meetings, that Ezekiel had been seen carrying messages between organizers, that the family was a threat to company interests that required immediate action. The accusations were entirely false, manufactured from nothing except Crawford's desire for revenge, but the system that should have verified such claims before acting on them was controlled by men who cared nothing for truth. The raid on the Fugate cabin came on the night of October 15, 1941. Crawford led 22 deputies up the mountain in darkness, far more men than any legitimate purpose could have required. They came with equipment that suggested their intentions went beyond simple arrest, came with a cage that had been constructed specifically for what Crawford had planned, came with the confidence of men who believed their authority was absolute. Ezekiel was away from home that night, had traveled to Virginia to visit a brother who was dying of the same lung disease that was slowly claiming him. Crawford had known about his absence. The raid had been timed specifically to ensure that only Martha and Samuel would be present, that the father who might have resisted would not be there to complicate the operation. Martha heard them coming. The sounds of men moving through forest at night carried farther than those men imagined, reached ears that had been listening for danger since childhood. She woke Samuel, told him to hide in the root cellar, promised him that she would handle whatever was approaching. But Samuel was 15 now, old enough to believe he should protect his mother rather than hide from threats, and he refused to descend into the darkness that offered safety. "I'll stay with you," he said, his voice carrying the stubbornness that had characterized Fugates for generations. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Martha did not have time to argue. The deputies were already at the door, their pounding demanding admission that she knew better than to refuse. She opened the door to find Crawford's face inches from her own, his expression showing satisfaction that years of waiting had finally produced this moment. "We're here for your husband," Crawford said, pushing past Martha into the cabin. "He's been organizing for the union. We have witnesses who saw him at meetings." "My husband isn't here," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest. "He's in Virginia visiting his dying brother. He has nothing to do with any union. He's a miner who goes to work and comes home. You have no cause to be here." Crawford ignored her. His deputies spread through the small cabin, their search deliberately destructive, their movements designed to demonstrate power rather than to find anything. They overturned furniture and scattered possessions and found nothing that supported the accusations Crawford had made, because there was nothing to find. But Crawford had not come to find evidence. He had come to punish the Fugate family for the testimony Ezekiel had given years before, and the absence of the father would not prevent him from completing the purpose that had brought him up this mountain. His attention shifted to Samuel, who stood near his mother with an expression that combined fear with defiance. The boy was 15, old enough to be used as leverage, young enough to be broken by methods that adults might resist. Crawford saw in Samuel an opportunity that exceeded anything he had originally planned. "The boy comes with us," Crawford announced. "He'll be held until his father turns himself in. If Ezekiel cooperates, the boy might be released eventually. If not." The threat was clear, was designed to accomplish through hostage-taking what direct arrest could not achieve. Crawford wanted Ezekiel to suffer, wanted him to know that his family had paid for the testimony that had sent a Crawford to prison. Taking Samuel was not about the union. It was about revenge that had waited years for satisfaction. Martha fought. She fought with strength that the deputies had not expected, with fury that sent grown men stumbling backward. With desperation, that injury could not diminish. She screamed for Samuel, reached for him through bodies that blocked her path, inflicted wounds on deputies who would carry scars from her resistance. But 22 men were too many. They overwhelmed her through numbers that skill could not contest, held her while others secured Samuel, demonstrated the power that their badges provided in ways that left no doubt about who controlled this situation. What they did next would haunt Martha's dreams for 50 years. They had brought a cage. The cage was made of iron bars, had been constructed specifically for this purpose, measured approximately 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high. It was designed for animals, might have been used for transporting livestock, or for containing dogs that were being trained for fighting. It was not designed for human beings, was not large enough to allow a person to stand or to lie fully extended, was a device of humiliation that would transform whoever was placed inside from a person into something less. Crawford had ordered the cage built during the weeks preceding the raid, had specified the dimensions with care, that suggested he had imagined Samuel inside it many times before the opportunity arose to make the imagination real. The bars were thick enough to prevent any possibility of bending them, close enough together that even a hand could barely pass between them. The floor was solid metal, cold and unforgiving, designed to be cleaned with water that would also soak whoever occupied the space. They forced Samuel into the cage while his mother screamed and fought against the men who held her. The boy was too large for the space, had to curl his body into positions that human anatomy was not designed to maintain, had to accept compression that would become agony within hours. His knees pressed against his chest, his head bent forward at angles that strained his neck. His arms wrapped around his legs because there was nowhere else for them to go. His face pressed against bars that left marks on skin that had never known such degradation. His limbs folded in ways that restricted circulation and promised pain that would only intensify. The metal was cold against his skin, would remain cold regardless of how long he occupied the space, would leach heat from his body through nights that lasted forever. "Mama!" Samuel screamed as the cage door closed, as locks clicked into place that his restrained hands could never reach. "Mama! Help me! Please help me!" Martha fought with renewed fury at the sound of her son's voice, inflicted injuries on deputies that would leave permanent scars. She broke free momentarily, reached the cage, touched Samuel's fingers through bars that would not permit more contact than that. The touch lasted only seconds before deputies dragged her away. But in those seconds she made a promise that her eyes conveyed even if her voice could not. "I will come for you," she said as they pulled her back. "I will find you. I will make them pay for this. Hold on, Samuel, hold on." "This is what happens to families who cross the Crawfords," Vernon announced, as his men secured the cage with locks that Samuel could not reach to open. "Your boy will stay in this cage until your husband turns himself in. Could be days, could be weeks. However long it takes, the boy will remain where he is, and every day that passes will be harder than the day before." The deputies laughed as they carried the cage away, joked about the animal they were transporting, made comments about training and discipline that reduced Samuel to something less than human, even before his imprisonment properly began. The sounds of their laughter and the sounds of Samuel's screams mixed in the night air created a harmony of cruelty that Martha would hear in her dreams for 50 years. They carried the cage to a location that Martha would not discover for days, a shed on company property where Samuel would be held like an animal, while the company waited for his father to surrender. The shed had been used for storing equipment, smelled of oil and coal dust and the sweat of men who had labored there. The cage was placed in a corner where straw covered the floor, where the smell of animals still lingered from previous occupants, where no light reached except when guards opened doors that were kept locked. Samuel spent 3 weeks in the cage, 3 weeks during which his body was compressed into positions that human anatomy could not sustain without damage. His muscles cramped constantly, spasms that shot through his legs and arms and back with pain that made him cry out until his voice gave out and crying became impossible. His joints stiffened in positions that would never fully recover, cartilage compressed and damaged by constant pressure that nature had never intended human joints to experience. His spine curved as the weeks passed, vertebrae shifting to accommodate positions that should have been temporary, but that became permanent as the days accumulated. The curve would remain for the rest of his life, would cause pain that varied from constant ache to stabbing agony depending on weather and movement, and factors that physicians would never fully understand. 3 weeks during which he was fed and watered like an animal, bowls pushed through bars that he could barely reach, contents that he consumed on his hands and knees, because the cage did not allow him to sit upright. The food was scraps from the guards' meals, cold and often spoiled, nutrition that was adequate to prevent death but insufficient to maintain health. The water was given in amounts that kept him alive but left him constantly thirsty, lips cracked and throat burning with thirst that was never fully satisfied. 3 weeks during which he soiled himself, because release from the cage for any purpose was not permitted, during which he lay in his own waste, while guards laughed and made comments about animals that could not be trained. The humiliation was as devastating as the physical suffering, reduced a boy who had been raised with dignity to something that could not maintain the basic functions that humanity required. The smell became overwhelming within the first week, a stench that the guards complained about while refusing to address its cause. They threw water over Samuel periodically, ostensibly to clean the cage but actually to soak him in cold that penetrated to his bones, that left him shivering through nights when the temperature dropped and his wet clothing provided no warmth. The guards tormented him throughout his imprisonment. They poked him with sticks through the bars, struck the cage to produce sounds that terrified him, described in detail what would happen to his parents if his father did not cooperate. They brought other workers to see the boy in the cage, displayed him as an example of what happened to families who defied company authority, reduced him to a spectacle whose suffering was entertainment for men whose humanity had been corrupted by power they could not responsibly wield. "Look at the little animal," one guard would say as workers gathered to stare. "This is what happens when families forget their place. This is what happens when minors think they can defy the company." The workers watched with expressions that ranged from horror to satisfaction, some clearly disturbed by what they were seeing, and others clearly enjoying the display of power that Samuel's suffering demonstrated. Their faces appeared in Samuel's nightmares for the rest of his life, an audience to degradation that no child should have experienced. The physical damage was severe. Samuel's muscles atrophied in the confined space, his joints stiffened in positions that would never fully recover, his spine curved in ways that would mark him for the rest of his life. Circulation to his extremities was impaired by positions that compressed blood vessels for hours at a time, causing damage that would manifest as permanent weakness in hands and feet that had been deprived of adequate blood flow. His hands would never fully recover their strength, would tremble when performing tasks that required fine control, would drop objects without warning, because nerves that had been compressed too long could not reliably communicate with muscles that had been damaged too severely. His feet would cause him pain with every step for the rest of his life, damaged nerves sending signals that the brain interpreted as fire and ice and sensations that had no name. But the psychological damage was worse. Samuel retreated into a place that the torment could not reach, withdrew from reality that had become unbearable, stopped responding to guards whose cruelty could no longer affect a mind that had disconnected from the body they were abusing. He stopped speaking during the second week, stopped making sounds of any kind, existed in a silence that suggested consciousness had departed, even though the body remained alive. Ezekiel returned from Virginia on November 5, 1941, 3 weeks after the raid that had taken his son. He found Martha in a state that exceeded anything he had imagined possible, a woman whose grief and fury had combined into something that the word devastated could not describe. She had spent 3 weeks trying to find Samuel, had discovered his location only 2 days before, had been preparing to rescue him through methods that would have gotten her killed. They went to the company property together, demanded the release of their son with voices that carried authority they did not actually possess. The company officials who met them showed no concern for the parents' distress, explained that Samuel would be released only when Ezekiel confessed to union organizing that he had never participated in, offered a choice that was no choice at all. Ezekiel confessed. He signed documents that admitted crimes he had never committed, provided testimony that implicated people he had never met, surrendered his integrity and his future to obtain the release of a son whose condition he had not yet been allowed to see. They brought Samuel out in the cage, carried it to the yard where his parents waited, set it down with casualness that suggested the contents were of no particular value. The boy inside did not move, did not respond to his mother's voice, did not show any sign of awareness that his imprisonment was ending. Martha's scream when she saw her son would be heard throughout the hollow, would be remembered by witnesses for the rest of their lives as the most terrible sound any of them had ever experienced. She saw what 3 weeks in the cage had done to Samuel, saw the positions his body had assumed, saw the waste that covered him, and the wounds that neglect had allowed to fester. She saw that the boy who had entered the cage was not the boy who was emerging from it. Samuel was carried home by parents whose grief exceeded what language could express. He did not walk because his legs would not support him, did not speak because his mind had retreated to somewhere that words could not reach, did not acknowledge the rescue that had come too late to prevent damage that would never heal. The weeks that followed were consumed by care that Samuel required, but that could not restore what had been taken. Martha cleaned wounds that had been ignored, fed a son who had forgotten how to eat normally, spoke to a boy who did not respond to words that should have been familiar. She watched him slowly return from whatever place his mind had retreated to, watched awareness gradually reappear in eyes that had been empty, watched horror replace the blankness as Samuel began to remember what had been done to him. He never fully recovered. The physical damage healed partially, left him with a limp and weakness in his hands, and a spine that curved in ways that would cause pain for the rest of his life. But the psychological damage was permanent, transformed a gentle and curious boy into something fragile and frightened, a person who flinched at sudden movements and could not bear enclosed spaces, and woke screaming from nightmares that reproduced the cage with accuracy that sleep could not soften. Ezekiel was arrested 2 weeks after Samuel's release, charged with the crimes he had confessed to, transported to a prison where he would serve a sentence that his damaged lungs could not survive. He died 6 months after his imprisonment began, the official cause listed as tuberculosis, but the actual cause being coal dust accumulated over 20 years of labor that had finally claimed what remained of his respiratory capacity. Martha buried her husband beside his parents in the cemetery where Fugates had been laid to rest for generations. She stood at the grave with Samuel beside her, felt something change inside her that had been building since the night the deputies came, felt the last restraint on fury that had been waiting for permission to express itself. "I will kill them all," she said, her voice carrying clearly through air that seemed to grow still as she spoke. Every man who was there that night, every man who helped put Samuel in that cage, every man who tormented him during those 3 weeks, I will kill them all and I will make them suffer. And when I am finished, no mother will ever experience what I have experienced, because men will know what happens when they harm children. The transformation that followed was methodical and complete. Martha spent the spring of 1942 gathering intelligence about the deputies who had participated in the raid and Samuel's subsequent imprisonment, learning their names and faces and routines through networks of kinship and obligation that connected mountain families across county lines. She compiled a list of 22 targets, memorized details that would allow her to find each one, regardless of where they might attempt to hide. She also prepared Samuel for what was coming. The boy could not remain on the property during what Martha intended to do, could not be present when consequences began to visit men who had tormented him. She arranged for him to stay with relatives in Tennessee, explained that she needed to handle business that would take time, promised that she would join him when circumstances permitted, a promise she knew she would probably not be able to keep. The farewell was the hardest thing Martha had ever done, harder than watching Samuel in the cage, harder than burying Ezekiel. She held her son, memorized his face against the possibility that she would never see him again, spoke words that tried to convey love that exceeded what language could express. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking on words that seemed inadequate. "I love you more than life itself. What they did to you will not go unpunished. I will make sure that every man who hurt you pays for what he did. And when it's over, either I'll come back to you or I'll be watching over you from somewhere beyond." Samuel looked at her with eyes that still held the emptiness that the cage had created, eyes that understood what she was planning, even though she had not explained it directly. He did not argue, did not plead for her to choose a path that did not require sacrifice. He simply held her, and in that embrace was acceptance of what had to be done. The first killing occurred on May 15, 1942, 7 months after the raid that had taken Samuel. A deputy named Dale Tackett was found in his home, his body displaying injuries that suggested prolonged suffering before death finally came. On his chest, carved into flesh that had ceased to bleed, were the words, "For Samuel." The investigation that followed produced nothing useful. The killing had been conducted with skill that exceeded anything local law enforcement had encountered, had left no evidence that could identify the perpetrator. The connection to the Fugate case was obvious, but the obvious suspect, the grieving mother, had disappeared, had not been seen since she had sent her son to Tennessee months before. The second killing came 3 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another deputy who had been present at the raid. Lawson was found in circumstances that matched Tackett's death. The same prolonged suffering, the same message carved into flesh, the same absence of evidence. The pattern that would define the spring and summer of 1942 had been established. That's right. Martha continued her campaign through the spring and summer, taking her targets with regularity that demonstrated patience and capability that investigators could not explain. The third killing came in June, the fourth in July, each following patterns that could be recognized but not predicted, each leaving the same message that identified the motivation but concealed the killer. The fear that spread through the sheriff's department was unlike anything Letcher County had experienced. Deputies who had participated in the raid and Samuel's imprisonment began to understand that they were being hunted, that something was systematically eliminating everyone who had participated in the boy's suffering. Some fled the county, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others demanded protection that the department could not adequately provide. A few resigned entirely, deciding that no salary justified the risk of becoming the next victim. The methods Martha employed reflected skills that her father had taught her, and that years of mountain living had refined. She moved through the forest without leaving traces that even experienced trackers could follow, approached her targets through routes that seemed impossible, struck at moments when her victims believed themselves safe. The terrain she fought on was terrain she had known since childhood, every ridge and hollow familiar in ways that no outsider could match. The 5th, 6th, and 7th killings came in rapid succession during August, Martha's pace accelerating as the remaining deputies' fear made them careless. Men who were afraid made mistakes, revealed patterns they would have concealed in calmer times, provided opportunities that a patient hunter knew how to exploit. The 8th and 9th killings were special. These deputies had been among the guards who had tormented Samuel during his imprisonment, had poked him with sticks and struck his cage, and made his weeks of suffering worse than they needed to be. Martha wanted them to experience something of what her son had experienced, wanted them to understand confinement and degradation before their deaths finally came. She captured them on successive nights, transported them to a location she had prepared deep in the forest, placed them in cages she had constructed from materials she had gathered over months. The cages were the same dimensions as the one Samuel had occupied, 4 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, spaces that would compress adult bodies into positions that human anatomy could not sustain. She kept them alive for 3 weeks, the same duration that Samuel had endured. She fed them through the bars as they had fed her son, watched them soil themselves as her son had been forced to do, observed as their bodies deteriorated in ways that mirrored what Samuel had suffered. She spoke to them throughout their imprisonment, explained in detail what they had done and why they were experiencing consequences that the legal system had refused to provide. "You laughed while my son suffered," she told them during visits that they came to dread more than the hunger and the cramping and the humiliation. "You made sport of a 15-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong. You treated him like an animal because you had the power to do so and no one would stop you. Now you understand what it feels like. Now you know what you did." The bodies were found 3 weeks after the abductions, in the cages where Martha had kept them. The condition of the remains confirmed that the deaths had not been quick, that the victims had experienced prolonged suffering that matched what Samuel had endured. The investigators who examined the scene found the cages positioned exactly as the original cage had been positioned, a symmetry that confirmed the motivation even as it horrified those who discovered it. The 10th through 15th killings cleared most of the remaining deputies, each death demonstrating that neither distance nor protection could save those who had participated in Samuel's torment. Deputies who had fled to other counties were found dead in locations that should have been safe. Deputies who had surrounded themselves with guards were taken despite precautions that seemed adequate. The message was clear. Nothing could protect those who had caged Martha's son. The 16th and 17th killings took guards who had been assigned to protect Crawford, men who were found dead in positions directly outside the safe house where the supervisor was hiding. The attacks occurred without alerting Crawford himself, demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exceed what any single person could possess. Crawford attempted to flee on September 28, 1942. He had arranged transportation that he believed was secret, had planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky and the vengeance that had claimed 20 of his men. He did not understand that Martha had been watching for exactly this attempt, had positioned herself to intercept any escape. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides, where an ambush could not be avoided. Crawford's guards died first, killed in seconds by shots from positions they never identified. Then Crawford was alone, trapped in a vehicle that was going nowhere, facing a woman who emerged from shadows that should have concealed nothing. "Do you remember Samuel Fugate?" Martha asked, her voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "Do you remember putting a 15-year-old boy in a cage for 3 weeks? Do you remember what your men did to him while he was confined? Do you remember reducing my son to an animal because his father had once told the truth about your brother?" Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains or anything that might delay what was clearly coming. But Martha had no interest in words, had not traveled this far, and killed this many to be satisfied with anything except completion of the task she had set herself. What Martha did to Vernon Crawford during the days before he died would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 50 years. The death involved a cage that Martha had constructed specifically for Crawford, dimensions that matched the cage Samuel had occupied, confinement that would last for the same 3 weeks that her son had endured. But Crawford's experience was worse than Samuel's had been. Martha visited him daily, administered torments that exceeded what the guards had done to her son, ensured that Crawford understood fully what he was experiencing and why. She kept him alive through the full 3 weeks, prevented death that might have provided mercy, extracted suffering that she considered adequate payment for what he had orchestrated. "My son still wakes screaming from nightmares about the cage," Martha told Crawford on the final day of his confinement. "He still cannot bear enclosed spaces. He still flinches when someone moves suddenly. You did that to a boy who had done nothing wrong, who was gentle and kind and had never harmed anyone. You broke something in him that will never heal. Now you understand what you did. Now you experience what you inflicted. And now you die, knowing that your death is merely the beginning of the justice that Samuel deserves." Crawford's body was never found. Martha buried him in a location she did not record, in a grave that she intended to remain undiscovered forever. The disappearance added to the legend that had already developed around the killings, suggested capabilities that exceeded even what the previous deaths had demonstrated. The remaining deputies, numbers 18 through 22, died in rapid succession during the final days of September. Martha no longer employed the extended suffering that Crawford had experienced, simply killed them with efficiency that suggested she was completing a task rather than extracting vengeance. The work was nearly done, and she had other purposes to prepare for. 22 men, every deputy who had participated in the raid and Samuel's imprisonment, every guard who had tormented him during his 3 weeks in the cage, every official whose badge had protected him from legal consequence, but who had discovered that other forms of justice still existed, all of them dead now, all of them having experienced consequences that the legal system had refused to provide. Martha Fugate disappeared into the wilderness that had always been her home, and she did not emerge for 50 years. The mountains of eastern Kentucky became her sanctuary, terrain that she knew better than any map could document, that concealed her through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less purpose. She found a location that no search could discover, a hollow so remote that even the mountain families who lived nearby did not know of its existence. She built a cabin from materials the forest provided, using techniques that her father had taught her and that generations of mountain people had refined. The structure was simple but adequate, designed for concealment rather than comfort, positioned so that smoke from her fires would disperse before rising high enough to be visible from any distance. She created a home that the wilderness hid, and that 50 years of solitary living would expand and improve. The construction took 3 months, 3 months during which she lived in a shelter of branches and bark, while the permanent structure took shape. She felled trees with an axe she had brought from home, shaped logs with patience that the work required, notched corners with joints that required no nails and that would hold through decades of weather. The cabin was small, a single room perhaps 12 feet by 15, but it was solid, would remain standing through 50 years of occupation. The roof required the most attention, had to be built to shed snow that could accumulate to crushing weights during winters that lasted 5 months. She used bark stripped from certain trees, layered it over poles that she positioned with angles she had learned from her father, created a covering that would keep the interior dry through decades of precipitation. The roof leaked during its first winter, required repairs that taught her lessons she applied to subsequent maintenance. She added to the structure over the years, built a smokehouse for preserving meat and a root cellar for storing vegetables through winters. She constructed a workshop where she could create tools and repair equipment without exposure to weather that would have made such work impossible. The complex that eventually surrounded her original cabin represented 50 years of continuous improvement, showed what determined labor could accomplish even without modern materials. The garden she established provided vegetables that supplemented the meat she obtained through hunting and trapping. The first garden failed almost entirely, planted in soil that proved too poor and in locations that received insufficient sunlight. She learned from the failure, moved the garden to a location that received more light, amended the soil with materials she gathered from the forest floor. The second garden produced better results, and each subsequent year improved as her understanding of the conditions deepened. She learned which crops thrived in the mountain conditions, adapted her techniques to challenges that her location presented, developed systems that produced reliable harvests through seasons that varied in their generosity. Potatoes and beans became staples, stored well through winters that could last 5 months. She grew varieties that her grandmother had cultivated, seeds saved from gardens that connected her to generations of women who had fed families from similar soil. The hunting required skills she refined through years of practice. She learned the patterns of deer that populated the ridges around her hollow, identified the routes they traveled and the times they moved along those routes. She positioned herself accordingly during seasons when their meat was most valuable, took only what she needed, and preserved what she took with skills that mountain women had developed over generations. She learned to construct traps that captured game without requiring her presence, snares that held rabbits and squirrels while she attended to other tasks. The traps were positioned along routes that small animals favored, baited with materials that experience taught her were most effective. She checked them daily during seasons when they were active, collected what they had captured, and reset them for the next day's catch. The first years were consumed by grief that the campaign of killing had delayed, but not eliminated. The vengeance had provided purpose while it lasted, focus that prevented the full weight of her losses from crushing her. Now, with the killing done and nothing remaining to distract her, the grief arrived with force that nearly destroyed her. She grieved for Ezekiel, whose death in prison had been caused by the same system that had tormented Samuel. She had loved him for 20 years, had built a life with him that the company had destroyed without any reason that justice could recognize. His absence was a weight that pressed down on her constantly, that made the isolation heavier than it would otherwise have been. She grieved for Samuel, whose damage could never be fully healed and whose future had been stolen by men who treated him as less than human. The boy she had raised was gone, replaced by something fragile and frightened that bore his face but lacked his spirit. She had avenged him, but vengeance could not restore what had been taken. She grieved for the life she had imagined, the grandchildren she had expected, the peaceful old age that violence had made impossible. She had expected to grow old surrounded by family, had expected to die in a bed with people she loved nearby. Instead, she would die alone, in a cabin that no one would find, after decades of isolation that no one would share. She spent months in states that alternated between catatonic stillness and fits of rage that sent her screaming through the forest. The screaming provided release that nothing else could offer, allowed her to express pain that had no other outlet. She screamed until her voice gave out, until the sounds that emerged were barely whispers, until exhaustion forced her to stop regardless of how much pain remained unexpressed. She called for Samuel, held conversations with a son who could not hear, created a relationship with the distant boy that became more real than any connection to the living could have been. She imagined his responses, heard his voice in her mind, speaking words that she constructed from memory of how he had spoken before the cage had silenced him. The conversations kept her connected to something beyond herself, prevented the dissolution of identity that pure isolation threatened. There were times when she considered ending her existence, when the weight of isolation seemed too heavy to carry. She would stand at edges of cliffs that offered quick release, would hold weapons that could end her suffering in seconds, would imagine reunion with Ezekiel that death might provide. The temptation was strongest in winter, when the cold seemed to penetrate everything, and the darkness lasted 16 hours, and the isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. But she could not die while Samuel lived. The son she had left in Tennessee was still alive, was being cared for by relatives who provided what his damaged condition required. She received word of him through networks that mountain families maintained, learned that he was surviving, if not thriving, that he had found a kind of peace that his condition allowed. She could not abandon him entirely, even if circumstances prevented her from ever seeing him again. The grief did not pass, but it transformed into something she could carry. Samuel remained present in her existence, a companion whose face she remembered and whose suffering she had avenged. She spoke to him daily, described her activities and asked for guidance that memory provided, maintained connection that distance and time could not entirely sever. She kept journals throughout her isolation, documented her days and thoughts in notebooks she made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals filled with observations about the forest and the seasons, with memories of Samuel and Ezekiel, with reflections on what she had done and why it had been necessary. "I killed 22 men," she wrote in an entry from 1960, 18 years into her isolation. "I killed them because they caged my son like an animal and laughed while he suffered. I killed them because the law protected them and abandoned Samuel. I killed them because vengeance was the only response available when every other avenue had been closed. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again, would do it 1,000 times if 1,000 times were required." She wrote about Samuel constantly, preserved memories of the boy he had been before the cage, transformed him into something fragile and frightened. She described his gentleness with animals, his curiosity about the world, his dreams of futures that the deputies had destroyed. The writing kept him alive in ways that memory alone could not accomplish. She watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. She saw roads improve and vehicles become more common, and aircraft appear in skies that had been empty when her isolation began. She observed the passing of decades through changes that affected even her remote location, saw the world move forward while she remained anchored to a past that the present had forgotten. She received news of Samuel periodically through networks that carried information across mountain ranges and state lines. She learned that he had married, though the marriage had not lasted because his damage exceeded what partnership could accommodate. She learned that he had worked various jobs, though none had lasted because his condition prevented reliability that employment required. She learned that he had aged, though not as quickly as she had, and that he still lived with relatives who provided care that his needs demanded. She was never able to see him again. The risk was too great, the possibility of leading pursuers to him too dangerous. She sacrificed the comfort of reunion for the protection that distance provided, loved him from afar, because loving him closely had become impossible. Samuel died in 1978, 36 years after the cage had transformed him from a vibrant boy into a damaged man. He was 52 years old, had lived his entire adult life with consequences of 3 weeks that should never have occurred. The news reached Martha through the same networks that had kept her informed throughout the decades, arrived in her hollow with weight that nearly crushed what remained of her will to continue. She mourned him in the wilderness, performed rituals of grief that the forest witnessed and absorbed. She carved his name into rocks that would outlast any human memory, created memorials that would remain when she was gone, honored the son she had avenged but had not been able to save. "He is at peace now," she wrote in a journal entry from that year. "The cage cannot reach him anymore. The nightmares cannot find him. The damage that they inflicted has finally released him. I should be glad that his suffering has ended. I am glad. But I am also more alone than I have ever been, and the years that remain to me seem longer than the years that have passed." She continued for another 14 years, sustained by determination that refused to surrender to circumstances that should have defeated her. She aged in the wilderness, her body growing weaker while her mind remained clear. The capabilities that had allowed her to kill 22 men and evade capture gradually diminished, replaced by adaptations that her intelligence devised. Martha Fugate died in her cabin on March 15, 1992, at the age of 90. She had survived alone in the wilderness for 50 years, had maintained her existence through skills that most people had forgotten were possible, had carried her grief and her secret through decades that would have destroyed anyone with less determination. Her body was found 6 months later by hikers who had ventured deeper into the mountains than anyone had explored in decades. They discovered the cabin she had built, the garden she had maintained, the evidence of an existence that had persisted in isolation for half a century. They found her remains in a bed she had made herself, surrounded by photographs of a boy and a man, whose faces showed the family she had lost. The journals were found beside her body, dozens of handmade notebooks that documented 50 years of survival and that contained confessions to 22 killings that had never been solved. The investigators who eventually examined these materials found answers to questions that had baffled authorities for 5 decades. The case files on the Letcher County killings were reopened, the new evidence examined with techniques that had not existed in 1942. The details matched perfectly. The victims, the methods, the timeline, everything that Martha had recorded corresponded to evidence that investigators had gathered 50 years before, but had never been able to connect to a suspect. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: maternal vengeance, impossible survival, decades of solitude, and truth that emerged only after everyone who might have been punished or vindicated was long dead. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Martha's account of what had been done to Samuel. Documents were found that confirmed the cage had existed, that confirmed deputies had tormented a boy for 3 weeks without any legitimate justification. The corruption that had enabled the atrocity was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. The descendants of the deputies learned that their ancestors had participated in caging a 15-year-old boy like an animal, had tormented him for 3 weeks while his mother begged for his release, had been protected by a system that called their cruelty legitimate. Some families had suspected something like this, had preserved stories that hinted at shame rather than mere misfortune. Others had believed official accounts, had mourned ancestors as victims of violence that had no justifiable cause. The moral philosophers who examined the case debated whether Martha's actions could be justified. She had killed 22 men over 5 months, had used methods that caused suffering that exceeded what any legitimate concept of justice could encompass. The horror of what she had done was undeniable, but her son had been caged like an animal, had been tormented for 3 weeks by men whose badges protected them from consequence. The mother's vengeance had been the only response that circumstances allowed, the only justice that would ever be achieved for Samuel Fugate. The descendants of Martha arranged for her remains to be buried beside Samuel, reunited in death as they had been unable to be in life. The graves bear inscriptions that the family considered appropriate. Samuel Fugate, 1926-1978. They caged him, they broke him, he is free now. Martha May Fugate, 1902-1992. She loved her son. She avenged her son. She never forgot. The songs that emerged from the Martha Fugate story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of what was done to Samuel and the fury of the mother who made 22 men pay. The first verse described Martha and Samuel before the tragedy, the bond between mother and son, the gentle boy who loved animals and dreamed of futures that violence would destroy. The melody was warm and tender, suggesting love that should have been allowed to continue. The second verse described the raid and the cage, the deputies who put a 15-year-old boy in a space meant for animals, the 3 weeks of torment that transformed a gentle child into something fragile and frightened. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Martha's transformation, the mother who became something else when her son emerged from the cage and her husband died in prison. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting calculation that had replaced feeling. The fourth verse described the campaign of vengeance, the 22 men who fell one by one over 5 months, the mother of Pine Mountain that no one could catch. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that could not be escaped. The fifth verse described the 50 years of solitude, the woman who became a ghost in mountains that had always been her home, the son who remained alive in memory long after the world had forgotten them both. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found meaning in sacrifice. The final verse described the discovery and the truth that emerged, the confession that solved mysteries 5 decades old, the reunion in death that life had denied. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Martha and Samuel rest together at last, to read the inscriptions that promise mother and son are finally reunited? Would you walk through the wilderness where Martha survived for 50 years? Would you try to understand how love could sustain a life that had lost everything except memory? The journey to Letcher County is easier now than it was in 1941, the roads paved and the world more connected than it was when deputies caged a boy for his father's testimony. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close. The graves of mothers and sons rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the woman who survived 50 years in the wilderness after slaughtering 22 men who caged her son like an animal. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when death brought reunion that life had denied. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the mothers who call them home.